Well, I will start by introducing myself. So I'm Gina Baysdorfer and I work at the Friendship Center. And I'm going to provide a really basic overview of domestic violence and things to think about and consider, and then some resources as well. So I'm going to have some visuals up while I talk. So hopefully everyone can see this cycle of violence that I have up on the screen. So I think the cycle of violence is a really helpful thing to know because it helps understand a little bit why some of these dynamics are very tricky. And so when we're talking about a violent relationship, it almost never starts out violent. So most of the times people get in these relationships that seem almost too good to be true. The person is very thoughtful, very caring, very loving, and it's a really wonderful experience in a lot of ways. And maybe a lot of our clients often describe it as something so different from what they've experienced before, just a lot of euphoria. And then over time, this tension that starts to come in. And so the tension building phase is where you might start to see a lot of like bickering. Maybe there's a couple bigger fights that involve some name calling or a little bit of belittling. A lot of clients will describe their partner as this Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde dynamic, where they're kind of one personality for a little bit and then it just flips really quickly and now they're this other personality and they're left feeling really confused and unsure what happened to cause that switch. And so in the tension building phase, there's a lot of moodiness. Maybe that affection is no longer present, so it's not as sweet or romantic or loving. There could be some property that starts getting destroyed, so that might be where we start seeing like thrones that are getting thrown, or remotes that are being thrown, holes that get punched in walls, things like that that are a little scary and really intimidating, but also not very extreme either. And then there often is this explosion. And so that is where we see a lot of extreme physical violence, although it's not always physical. Sometimes we'll see an incredibly intense verbal tirade where maybe somebody is being screamed at for like 3 hours and just the most horrific things are being said. Often it involves some physical or sexual violence. And so we see strangulation, which is almost always referred to as choking by clients that we work with, hitting, being blocked in a room, pushed up against a wall, things like that. Again, we might also see some more objects that are being thrown or used as weapons. We'll see sexual assaults during this phase as well. And then after that, we see this honeymoon phase that comes back in. And so that is where the offender is often very apologetic. They are very providing a lot of maybe reasons or justifications for what happened. So a lot of apologies, promises to go to counseling, promises to change. There might be a lot of gifts or other things to try to repair that damage. And so it might be something where that person is thinking they're probably pretty shocked, a little thrown off, and it often feels very surreal is what our clients will describe to us. And so in that honeymoon phase, a lot of times there might be a justification where, let's say, the person had a horrible day at work, their boss yelled at them, they got into a fender bender on the way home, and they just lost their cool. It'll never happen again. They're so very sorry. And another thing to think about with this cycle of violence is how it starts, right? So similar to how a relationship doesn't start violent, often this phase doesn't start with the most extreme situations either. So if you can picture those graphs where it starts down here and it kind of goes up, this will be the tension building phase. The peak is going to be this acute explosion. So maybe at the start of the relationship, that is getting pushed or shoved. And then it'll dip down into this honeymoon phase. It'll be really good for a while. And then it'll creep back up with that tension. And then we'll see that other explosion. And now the explosion might be somebody's getting pushed and also something thrown at them. And maybe they got hit this time too. And that pattern will continue over time. So what we tend to see is that the honeymoon phase tends to get farther and farther apart, and then sometimes disappears altogether. And then we see the acute explosion, or that, that really big incident phase, where it increases both in frequency and severity of violence. And so at the kind of the top part of that chart, you just see this straight line where it's tension, explosion, tension, explosion, tension, explosion, or we'll just see explosion, 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 explosion. And so it's a really predictable pattern. what is really unpredictable about that pattern is how long that takes and the way that it comes out. So this cycle might be something that repeats itself within a matter of days, or it could be something that repeats itself over a matter of months, or even for some clients we've served, maybe years. And so when somebody is in a relationship and you're thinking about that early stage, it's going to be a lot of honeymoon, a lot of wonderful moments with some tension creeping in. And then that acute explosion is going to be more of those minor levels of violence that people are much more likely to deny in a lot of ways as really being violent. They're going to take those promises of change, those justifications, and they're going to think, boy, you know, I've had really terrible days and I've lashed out and I've done things that I didn't meet. And here's all this history of great things in our relationship. I'm sure this was a one-time thing. And by the time it becomes clear that this is actually a very much not a one-time thing, that person is often very involved or enmeshed in that relationship. They really love this person. Maybe they have a house or an apartment together. Maybe they have pets or children together. Their money has been entangled, things like that. The other thing that contributes to that are this power and control wheel that I'm going to switch to. So hopefully everyone can see that. So these are the ways that offenders keep that power and control over that person. So by the time somebody has realized that they maybe are in an unsafe relationship, this pattern is not going to change. Maybe the violence is getting worse. It's getting more frequent. They're getting more scared. There's probably a significant amount of power and control that the offender has over them at that point. So you'll see at the center of this wheel is power and control. And then on the outer rim is physical and sexual violence. And so that is how that offender really maintains that power and control, is there is a ever-present, constant looming threat of physical and sexual violence, even if that necessarily hasn't happened yet in the relationship. And then these chunks of the pie are all the different strategies for how they keep that power and control and how they maintain that presence of physical and sexual violence. So we have coercion and threats, where they're threatening to hurt them very directly. Maybe they're threatening to leave. A lot of our clients have partners that threaten suicide. And that is a really emotional thing for our clients, because they care about this person. They don't want them to be hurt, but it also really sends the message that I don't value life. And oftentimes the underlying threat there is, I'm going to take you with me first. And so that can be a very terrifying threat, and then made more complicated if you share children or other things. And so coercion and threats are really powerful. They can also be more indirect. And so I can think of a client that I worked with once who used to talk about her partner cleaning their weapon at the table, talking about various places in the woods that nobody would hear anyone if they screamed, or where they could bury a body. And so that, to that client, felt like a very clear and direct threat, while on the outside surface might not necessarily seem that way to another person. Intimidation is another big piece of this. And so obviously what I just described would fall under intimidation, but it can also be anything that would make somebody afraid. So if somebody's like kind of really puffing up and getting in your face, a lot of us would think, oh gosh, I wonder, like they're bracing themselves for a physical fight. And so you might think that you are going to be hurt in some way. Emotional abuse is very common. It is probably present in every relationship for a client that I've worked with. And so that's where we're going to see belittling. That's where we're going to see name calling. We're going to see some gaslighting as well. So there was a client that I worked with once where she had a space for her keys by her front door. Like, I don't remember if it was a hook or a dish, but a specific place she put them every time. And she would go to leave and her keys would never be there. And she would find them just in the most bizarre places, in the fridge or in the bedroom, inside a drawer. Sometimes she would swear she looked at that key ring and then it wasn't there, and she'd go back and it was there. And what prompted her to come in and seek services with us was that one of these instances where she couldn't find them, her partner bent over and her keys fell out of his pocket. And so he had been taking her keys and hiding them in all these different places around the house to make her feel like she was going crazy. And so that gaslighting, where you're really intentionally manipulating somebody's reality so that they question their own judgment, is really powerful, because then if you don't trust your judgment, you're much less likely to you're more likely to minimize or to believe those justifications, especially if you also feel worthless, you feel stupid, you feel like nobody's going to love you, and all of these really awful messages that their partner is telling them. Isolation is another big piece that we see a lot. Isolation can be really what people think about. I mean, we live in a rural state, so it can be physical isolation where you live on 20 acres outside of town, you don't have good cell phone service, maybe you don't have internet service, things like that. But we can also have that social isolation where this person has really embarrassed you in front of your friends and family. And so now you don't go out with your friends or family, or you've minimized that contact because you know that they don't approve of your relationship. Or perhaps your partner has told you that you're not allowed to go out with your friends and family, you're not allowed to call them, you're not allowed to speak with certain coworkers or things like that. And so isolation can be really powerful because we lose our ability to talk to other people about our experience and get that feedback of what we're feeling is valid or justified. And it also makes it hard to reach out. If I have a friend that I think I've burned that bridge because they hate my partner, they think I'm dumb too, which my partner also tells me, I'm not going to call and reach out to them because I think they won't help me, or I think that they'll just tell me it's my fault. And so that isolation can be really huge when we're thinking about people who are trying to maybe break away from these dynamics. Minimizing, denying, and blaming is something that I think the best way to describe it is really that faux apology. It's done typically very slick. Sometimes it's very outright and also will fall into gaslighting in the sense of somebody really denying that you just had a fight, that they did hit you, things like that. Most often we see that minimizing and blaming. And so what that looks like is there's been an incident. Maybe I talked to my partner and I'm saying, hey, that really wasn't okay. And my partner says, you're right, that absolutely wasn't okay. I had this horrible day. I got really frustrated and, I came home and I just saw that you hadn't vacuumed like you said you were going to do. And there's all this stuff out in the yard and I got really upset and I just didn't know how to handle it. And so I lashed out at you. And, next time, if you just do the things that you said you were going to do, this wouldn't be an issue. And so it starts to sound like a really good apology. It starts to sound like somebody taking accountability, but really what it has done is said, what I did really didn't happen. If it did happen, it really wasn't that bad. And ultimately, it was your fault for something that you did. And so you start that conversation feeling really confident that you were in the right, and you leave that conversation feeling like maybe I was being unreasonable and maybe it wasn't that bad. And well, I did do these XYZ things, and so this is my fault. And so it just compounds on top of all of these other things we've been talking about. Children is one that is also used frequently in these relationships. Children are often used as pawns, so threats to take children away, threats to hurt the children, violence happening in front of the children. We also hear a lot of misinformation about our legal system and about child and family services. So a lot of our clients will come to us and say, well, I have 3 kids. I can only afford a 2-bedroom apartment. And, CFS is going to take my kids away if I don't have 3 bedrooms, 1 for each kid, which is not based in fact. And so that can be really, really traumatizing and hard for people. Our court system as well will often see charged violence against one of the partners as a separate issue entirely from parenting. And so even if somebody has been convicted or pled guilty, for instance, to a partner family member assault or to strangulation, they will often still award joint custody pretty equally, seeing parenting as a separate issue from the violence. And so that can be really hard for people as well when they're trying to decide what to do with their relationship. Pets are also often used in the same context of threats to harm the pets, threats to take the pets, abandoning the pets, things like that. And so that is also a really powerful thing for a lot of clients. Using male privilege, I think, is one that sometimes trips people up. Using male privilege does not mean that if you have that traditional heterosexual relationship where one person goes to work and one person stays home, it's automatically abusive. What it means is adhering to rigid gender roles and treating that partner as a servant, like they don't have a choice in that dynamic. So if you have 2 people that come together and say, I want to go to work, I want to stay home, and they both feel good about that decision, and at any point they can come back to the table and renegotiate that, that's fantastic. What this chunk means is you have a situation where you have that same dynamic where you have one person that plays one role, a different person that plays another role, and there is no power or ability to renegotiate those terms at any point. And this power and control wheel is really referencing that male-female dynamic, but you can find power and control wheels for every possible relationship out there, and also with unique identifying factors. So you can find heterosexual relationships, homosexual relationships. You can find people that are in the military, people that are in rural locations, people who are immigrants or refugees, things like that. And so there's lots of different power and control wheels, and you'll see some slight variations on some of these pie chunks. And then economic abuse is the last one on this power and control wheel. And so this is where that money is really being abused in one way. So it can look, I think probably the more stereotypical version is it'll look like somebody who has control of the money. So maybe one partner who goes to work has access to the money, doesn't let their partner have access. But it can also be that the victim in this relationship is the one going to work and earning that income, but they have no access to it still. Or perhaps their partner runs up debt and is opening loans and credit cards in that other person's name, so that they're really very trapped financially. When they go to apply for a job, their employer says, wow, you've got terrible credit. Or that when they go to apply for an apartment, that landlord says, wow, you've got terrible credit. And so they have these mounds of debt, so that even if they could afford to get out, they have this other baggage that's being carried with them that is making other people question whether or not they're going to be reliable tenants, and whether they're going to be reliable employees and things like that. And so for the power and control wheel, similar to the cycle of violence, the pattern itself is very predictable. So if I sit down with a client and I describe the cycle of violence and the power and control wheel, if they're in a violent relationship, 9 times out of 10, they're going to say, oh my gosh, you just described my entire relationship. But it's going to look a little bit different for every person when it comes down to those details. So one relationship might have more coercion and threats, emotional abuse, and economic abuse. A different relationship might have more minimizing, denying, and blaming, using children, using intimidation, and things like that. The physical and sexual violence as well, like I mentioned, it's always looming in the background. So sometimes it's looming in the background because that person has been very physically or sexually violent with their partner. Sometimes it's looming in the background because they've made it clear that they're willing or capable of doing that, and their partner really believes them, even though it hasn't happened yet in that relationship. So examples I can think of are the very direct threats of I will do X, Y, and Z. Or it could be that maybe they have this very long history. Maybe it is somebody who is on the violent or sex offender registry. Maybe it is someone that they were out at a restaurant or a bar and they got into a fight with somebody else and beat that other person to a bloody pulp. And so they've seen that violence and know that person's capable. So that offender in that case doesn't necessarily need to use the physical and sexual violence with their partner, because that partner is already quite fearful and knows that it could happen. And so it goes a long way to keeping that power and control. And so that is those foundational things that we'll see in all of those relationships. And what I want to talk about now is what can you do as a friend, coworker, family member, or what can you do if you're somebody who is thinking, maybe I'm not in a safe relationship and I need to reach out for help. So in terms of resources you can go to, I'm going to reshare my screen with a different view here. So hopefully you can see this website called Love is Respect. I think Love is Respect is one of the best websites to go to if you're wanting to get more of that basic information and also figure out how does this fit for me. So they have lots of different information about dating, about healthy relationships. They provide a lot of information about safety planning in the different contexts. And then they're also recognizing that maybe you have a friend or a family member who wants to support somebody. And so they'll have that information as well. And then they also have a lot of quizzes. And so in the resources, they'll have quizzes where you can take to assess, am I in a safe relationship? Am I not? And then they do other topics as well. And so they have youth-oriented quizzes, they have adult-oriented quizzes. And so they're really a great resource to check out if you're wanting more information. And so I just want to flag that for everyone. And then thinking more concretely about that, things that you might notice if you are in the relationship yourself. So ways that you might be clued into the fact that my relationship is maybe not very safe, there's some issues with it, is going to really come down to a lot of that power and control and ultimately boundaries. I would say boundary violations is the first warning sign that your relationship could progress to violence down the road. And so that would be telling somebody that you're not comfortable with something. Maybe they said a joke that hurt your feelings and then they laughed about it, or they didn't apologize, or they continued to say more jokes along that same vein. Perhaps it's saying that you want a night to yourself just for some peace and quiet, and they texted you and they called you, or they showed up with, even if it's something that seems very sweet and romantic, maybe they showed up with movies and dinner, but you really wanted that night to yourself and you were really clear about that. And so that's a violation of boundaries. And so the more people push on those boundaries and violate them, the more they're going to continue to do that generally over time. And that doesn't necessarily mean it will extend all the way into an abusive relationship, but that's some of those early things to look for. Other things that are some indications are, like I mentioned earlier, those really dramatic mood swings. That can be an indication that somebody might be more prone to violence in the future. I think anytime you belittle or demean or call somebody names, that's at bare minimum somebody who struggles with conflict resolution and communication, but again, could be a warning sign for some of these additional issues to come in. And then obviously any physical or sexual violence, regardless of the reason for it, it's not okay. And it always creates a power dynamic at play. So really, when you think about relationships on a spectrum, on one end, you have healthy relationships. On the other end, you have abusive relationships. And in between, there is a varying degree of unhealthy relationships. So those are relationships that have abusive behaviors and abusive dynamics, but lack that central power and control. And so for a lot of relationships, they start as seemingly healthy and they creep along that spectrum until they hit abusive. And sometimes they don't. And so that could be people that do genuinely struggle with communication and conflict resolution. And it's not ever necessarily going to get to that power and control. But anytime you have those dynamics at play, you have that increased risk for those violence. And so I think those are some of those immediate things to look for. I think the way that if you're a friend, a family, or a support system, the things that might clue you into something might be going on with my loved one is something about them maybe seems changed or off. So maybe it's somebody who used to be very cheerful, very outgoing, very vibrant, and now they seem maybe more anxious or withdrawn. I think flakiness is one that we see a lot in the work setting. A lot of our clients will come in and say that their boss is really getting frustrated because they seem very flaky because they show up late to work, or they are missing appointments, or even when they're present at work, they're not really present and focusing on their work because they're very distracted by this other thing happening. Or maybe their phone is blowing up every hour with their partner harassing them, wanting to know what they're doing, who they're talking to, things like that. I think partners that show up unexpectedly to work, and when the employee doesn't seem particularly thrilled about it, or it seems like there's some level, again, when it comes back to that power and control around it. And so it doesn't seem something that the person has invited them to do, or is excited that they're there, or things like that can sometimes be a red flag. And so I think the important thing to consider with any red flag is that it doesn't necessarily mean something violent is happening, but it also doesn't necessarily mean that nothing is happening. And so the more red flags, the more concerning, but ultimately it comes down to talking with that person and asking them if they're safe, if they need support, what's going on, things like that. And maybe providing them resources to a safe and confidential place that they can speak with about these issues. Some people are very hesitant to open up to those in their personal lives because they're afraid of judgment, they're afraid of losing their job, maybe they're very embarrassed about what's going on, and maybe they themselves aren't in a space where they are able to recognize or willing to recognize where they're at in that relationship or how that relationship might be. They might be very, very invested still. And so they're going to feel really defensive of their partner because they love their partner. And there's a lot of good things in the relationship too. And so I think what would be my advice when people call us and say, how do I help my friend, is to believe them if they say they're unsafe. People will typically underestimate their level of danger versus overestimate it. So if they say they're unsafe, if they say their partner is abusive, even if that partner seems so nice and so charming on the surface, I would encourage you to believe them and believe what their experience has been, and then to listen. A lot of people are very tempted to jump in and fix it, but often we don't want people to jump in and fix it for us. And so I would listen, tell them that you're there for them, and ask them how you can help. And then offer maybe to get them connected to resources. So if there are resources within your employment agency that can be helpful in terms of your HR or maybe supervisors when it comes to creating safety plans or talking through work performance and how it's being affected. And then there are resources like the Friendship Center where we can speak with somebody about these dynamics, help provide that information, help them figure out where they feel that fits within their relationship. And then if necessary, safety plan, talk about safe shelter, talk about coordinating with law enforcement or anything else that they might need services for. So I know I provided a lot of information very quickly. So I would like for anyone to ask any questions that they have, and I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Gina, for providing this excellent overview of signs of domestic violences and also resources available for those who are concerned or affected. And so, again, if people have questions, it sounds like Gina is willing to take those now.
This is Bill, and if a manager sees that maybe a couple that became a couple in the workplace and they start to see that there may be some issues, any recommendations for how the manager should handle that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it can be really tricky because if you don't really know what's going on, it can be hard to know how to approach it. I would think in that situation, it sounds like there might be a pretty clear idea of who might be the person that is wielding more of that power and control in the relationship. And so I think talking to the other person alone and letting them know, I've seen some things that I'm worried about, and I just want to let you know what I've seen and check in with you and see how you're doing and if there's anything I can do to support you, and sort of leave it open to them for whether or not they feel comfortable disclosing. And then also I think if there's a way that it feels to safely provide resources to like the Friendship Center, or if there's another more local agency for them to be able to reach out. Community-based programs are typically free and confidential. So the Friendship Center, all of our services is free, and there is a state law that says advocate privilege belongs with the person and their information cannot be shared with anybody without their consent. So sometimes that's helpful for people to know as well, especially in very small towns where they might be worried about that small town grapevine. So I would say talking with that person and opening the door to, I see some things that I'm worried about, I care about you, and I'm here if you want to share anything. And if you don't feel comfortable sharing anything with me, know that there's this other resource that you could go to.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Yeah.
As a follow-up to that, Gina, I was hoping you could answer, what advice would you offer to a person who's concerned about a colleague or a friend, a family member, but they're afraid that they'll offend that person if they inquire about relationship safety?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. We talk with a lot of friends and family members who even are volunteers and like new staff, really afraid of not wanting to say the wrong thing and risk damaging that relationship. My experience has been over the years that asking really hard questions, being really direct is often better than dancing around a subject. People know what you're asking and what you want to know. And I think it's really okay to be very transparent about that concern. And so being able to say, I really want to ask you something because I love you and I'm worried about you, or because I care about you, whatever feels appropriate for that relationship. And I also really don't want to offend you. So please tell me if I'm off base or if this is not a conversation you want to have. And I just want you to know that I care about you. And then, say, I've seen that this person is calling you all the time and you seem pretty upset by it. And I just want to know, are you safe? Or, whatever the situation might be. So I think most people are very understanding. And I think as long as they feel that that's really genuine, what they're going to hear is I care about you, rather than if you fumble with the words or if it's something that they're not ready to talk about. And so I think it's okay to be open about that piece.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful.
Yeah.
Other questions from the group? If not, thank you again for the work that you do, Gina, and for talking to us about the Friendship Center. This has been very informative. We appreciate it.
Well, I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity, and we're certainly open and available for not only people that need services themselves, but we often provide a lot of support to friends, family, coworkers, supervisors. We get a lot of referrals that way, and people who just want to know how they can help. And so we're happy to have those conversations too.
Thank you.